Good evening. Is this on? Oh, good evening. Welcome. If everybody in the back could start moving in, grab your seats while there's still a few left. Awesome. Welcome to Tales from the Trenches. My name is Josh Chapman. I'm the COO here at Matter. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but for those of you who have not been to Matter before, we believe that collaboration is the key to improving healthcare. And our community is made up of over 200 cutting-edge startups that are working with innovative companies, universities, health systems, hospitals to build the future of healthcare. And tonight, I'm thrilled to have one of our member companies here to talk about their journey to building the future of healthcare. So one of the things that I found interesting is preparing for tonight that we frequently are asked to give talks about what are some of the trends in healthcare, what are the things we are seeing from our startups, and there are many amazing things that are going on in healthcare. But one of the categories, and I had this happen to me on Friday, that draws the most attention is digital therapeutics. When you talk to someone about the fact that their next prescription may be for software and not for a pill or a liquid, it's kind of hard for them to wrap their brains around it. They always have a ton of questions. So I couldn't be happier to have Dr. Corey McCann here tonight, the founder and CEO of PEAR Therapeutics, who was the first company to have an FDA-approved digital therapeutic. It happened last fall. It's their product known as Reset. So without further ado, I'm going to have Corey come in and talk about that with our host, Rishi Shah from Jumpstart Ventures. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hello?
We're off to a great start.
Thank you, Corey, for joining us this evening. We're really excited to have you here with us. Corey's kind of dropping in on his journey from Boston to San Francisco because he's got...
Other way around.
Oh, the other way around.
Same geographies.
He's got offices in both places, and he actually has had great news at PEAR in the last week. I'll let you maybe talk about that a little bit, but they've got their first partnership around really the first FDA-approved digital treatment.
Excellent. So I guess before we dig in here, I would just like to offer up a word of apology. I'm incredibly sick, and I am just up to the gills in Sudafed. So to the extent that you hear any sort of sneezes, sniffles, coughs, let's just ignore that. Also, if I say anything crazy, I'm going to blame it on the Sudafed. And lastly, if I don't shake your hand, please don't take it personally in any way. I'm trying to keep my disease halo as minimal as it can possibly be. But I guess with all of that as a negative aside, yeah, we had really, really interesting news come out last week, and you're still seeing some of the read-through on that news this week. So we just announced that Novartis will be our commercial partner for the commercialization of Reset and Reset-O, or digital therapeutics to treat substance use disorder and opiate use disorder, respectively. And this is obviously a big moment for us, but it's a big moment for the space. This is the first time... No, that's much too kind. Thank you. This is the first time that pharma will be directly detailing a piece of software to treat disease, i.e. a digital therapeutic. And we think that this really signals the beginning of pharma's move into the space. So I know that I used a bunch of terms of art there, happy to unpack all of those things, but we are really excited about that news.
It's terrific. And one thing we need is just a tablet for the social Q&A. We always like to start kind of early here at Tales. And you've got a bunch of pretty interesting stories throughout your life, but including some that are pretty early. Your mom's a scientist. You grew up in an academic family. Your dad's a professor of economics, and you'll see how that kind of comes together later. But you were always kind of a scientist since you were a kid, and including some adventures when you were 5. Maybe we can share that with the group.
It's a great setup. I get the distinct feeling that you've done this sort of thing before.
I have,
It's,
a couple times.
we were just chewing the fat backstage, looking for some interesting childhood anecdotes. And I think there's sort of this thread of curiosity. I'm a scientist by passion. And there's this thread of taking things apart and failing to put them back together. And so one of my sort of favorite childhood quips is probably around 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that range. I was doing this very, very rigorous set of experiments trying to determine the molten properties of silly putty vis-a-vis the microwave. And you know, I was really just going to town. I was a little bit of a latchkey kid. My parents, you know, both worked, and I would come home and just get into all sorts of trouble, which in hindsight was really dangerous. But there was this one moment where I think I had this industrial-sized microwave set to like 25 minutes with this big lump of silly putty in the middle of the microwave. And my mother walks into the room, and the microwave's at like 22 minutes. And she just completely loses it. I mean, this was obviously a fire hazard. This was not a good thing to be doing. And so the punchline is that my mother, she's a scientist, but she also happens to be an innovator when it comes to punishments. And so she devised this whole scheme where I had to study a chapter of the microwave cookbook on a weekly basis. And I would get this written quiz at the end of each week, and it was a pass-fail. It wasn't graded on a curve, but it was pass-fail with an N of 1. And to this day, I am the only person that knows how to use the plug-in turkey thermometer on this like 1982 microwave. So that's one of my passions.
So we get a picture of the environment growing up, and you know, you continue on with your scientific quest, and you end up as an MD, PhD. And you know, tell us a little bit about that, but also what you did afterwards, working in life sciences venture capital.
Yeah, so I think maybe continuing on this thread of curiosity, I have always been and continue to be very passionate about understanding the brain. I think it's sort of it's the circular discovery for me. If you can understand how the brain does what it does, then there's sort of some sort of like a consciousness rabbit hole that you can go down. It's really interesting. And so I was really passionate about becoming a professional in studying the brain, and I'll loop back to a story about my mother. So she brought out this set of charts and graphs about the diminishing value of a life science PhD and told me, Corey, that's the stupidest thing you could ever possibly do. And so this turned into a little bit of a hedge where how do you do science safely? And maybe that's our next talk.
Right.
But doing science safely was developing some sort of clinical skill set, i.e. the MD, PhD, so that you're not at the mercy of the grant funders. And so I very begrudgingly started down the path of being a physician scientist. I was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a good clinician. I spent the entirety of the beginning of my medical school career in the lab, and I spent the entirety of the end of my medical school career working with a venture capital firm. And so my passions were obviously elsewhere. But I think the set of questions that I became very passionate about in a lot of ways frames part of the story that you'll hear today. So I worked with this team of scientists by the name of Josh Sains and Jeff Lichtman. And you may have seen some of their work. The brainbow is sort of one of these things that has worked its way into popular consciousness. If you haven't seen it, Google image search it. It's a really, really neat set of images. And so what we were working to do was to develop these genetic tools to be able to see the way that the brain works with sort of bespoke in-house microscopic techniques. And so I spent a lot of time working with the one to develop these techniques and working with the other to build microscopes in order to image those techniques. And I think genetics and imaging is one way to think about the two of them. Another way to think about the two of them is experience versus molecules. So they are the two scientists who have done most of the work in understanding the way that molecules pattern the developing nervous system, and then that experiences pattern the developing nervous system. And I think just to weave a relatively consistent thread here, The answer to me was fairly obvious, which was that it's both. The answer to them was also fairly obvious, which is that it was either. But I think it sort of set along this course of thinking about ways to drugify cognitive experience, which ultimately becomes software as a drug, which ultimately becomes digital therapeutics. So I won't go sort of too far down that path, but that was the science chapter. Mentioned a little bit about the venture chapter, which for me is just really about interacting with cool people and seeing cool science. And there is, depends on who you are, it's either a very privileged or a very tedious task of taking the stack of hundreds of pitches and narrowing it down to tens of pitches. But it was really an opportunity to get to see the breadth of science and the innovation side of science, which, as I'll confess, was not the tech side of things, as we've wound up here, but was more the traditional biotech and drug development side of things.
And so, you know, when you were in venture on the life sciences side, in a given year, how many things would you see, and what would interest you? How would you decide what to lean into, and what was your framework for that?
So, I think, and I've spent two posts in venture, and you know, more is more when it comes to deal flow. So I think venture funds almost universally go out of their way to see as many deals as they possibly can. And so that for me was somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 deals a year. And it means that we would just look at everything. Look is a relatively vague term here. And in the end, that usually means that you're looking for team, novelty, and pattern fit. And so I think in a lot of cases, and I'm sure that everyone in this room knows this, it's really hard to raise a first-time round. So the venture deck is stacked for people that have raised before and been successful before. I think everyone who is in venture does it because it's fun and it's cool. There are better and probably easier ways to make money, and so you have to sort of tickle someone's fancy. So it has to have a cool factor, but then it also has to have this degree of pattern recognition. And I think where this comes full circle with the PEAR story is that at the time, and really still on the life science venture side, you've got kind of two flavors of investments. It's either oncology or it's rare disease. Those are the flavors. Right. And I'm speaking from a very heavily biotech as opposed to med tech or digital health perspective, but those were the two flavors. And you know, that was something that gave me a lot of pause, and I spent a lot of sleepless nights sort of thinking about how you could convince someone who's used to approving an oncology deal that it made sense to do a CNS deal. And again, I think that was a really hard sell if you're looking for a novel molecule or a novel medical device treatment. The answer for me turned out to be looking again at cognitive experience, thinking about ways to drug cognitive experience, and basically turn that into a play at scale.
And so maybe now we'll fast forward a little bit into PEAR, but you know, you had experience at McKinsey and then again in venture, and then you find yourself in, I think it was 2011, you'd mentioned at this Neuro gaming conference, and it had become an interest. And tell us about that field a little bit. Who was there, what they were talking about, and the experience that led you to begin to think about PEAR.
So maybe this would all be in the backdrop of saying that I'm someone who is pretty aggressively anti-conference, anti-question. And so I just so happened to be at this conference returning from a vacation, and I was really interested in this idea of software as a drug, which really wasn't an idea, but was just kind of a crazy passion play. And so a friend of mine by the name of Zach Lynch, who is now an investor via Jazz Venture Partners, was running this thing called the Neuro Gaming Conference, and this was the first ever Neuro Gaming Conference. And it was just as crazy as the name implies. So it was a bunch of game developers who were starting to think about how to leverage psychology to do stuff. And there was one panel within the Neuro Gaming Conference which was about neurogaming in healthcare. And that just sort of happened to be this aggregation of people who were doing things that were quasi-related to treating disease. And this was very uncharacteristic for me. I don't think this may be one of 10 questions in a large audience I've ever asked in my entire career. At the end of the panel, I stood up and I asked the question, so who pays how much and why? And I mean, it's a little bit of an unfair question because it's 3 questions, but it was just silence and crickets in the room. And I think this was one of these rare moments where no one even hazarded any sort of a guess. There was no hypothesis. There was no business model to any of these things. And so it sort of set up a little bit of a moral imperative to not just ask, but to answer the question. And so at the time, we were in the midst of, I guess, what I would call digital health 1.0, which was this sort of tech and Silicon Valley thesis that said that tech is cool, people are sick, self-insured employers will pay for everything. And that was sort of the 3 bullet point thesis. And what that implies is you don't really need data, regulation is redundant, let's just get this out there and it's going to work. And I didn't believe that, and I think just in the spirit of full transparency, I didn't know how to build that company. So I have no idea how to build a company which monetizes clicks or which purports to flip data to Google for $1 billion at the end of the story. I just don't know how to do it, and I've said no to those kind of stories throughout the balance of my career. What I do know is the pharma model. And in the pharma model, that means this is, and apologies for any redundancy based on what people have heard earlier today, but this is, depending on who you ask, a 2 to 3 part sale. So it is something where patients consume, clinicians prescribe, and payers pay. And if you look at the strategies that haven't gotten to scale, they've been payer focused, and surprise, surprise, payers use for a little, payers push on clinicians, and clinicians don't care, don't use. If you look at approaches which have been clinician-focused, generally speaking, payers don't pay, and they don't get to scale, and they sort of spiral downward. And so if you try to take that as a lesson, the thing that works is, again, the pharma model. You need to change physician behavior, you need to create efficacy, and you need to get payers to pay for a product as opposed to a service. And so these probably sound like somewhat nebulous concepts now. They were extremely nebulous and poorly formed at the time. But the punchline is that it gave us this notion that you could drugify software. You could take software down a traditional drug-like approach.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this, and I think so different than so many other stories, is normally an entrepreneur will see a specific application, or as you said, a piece of technology or a specific product, and say, okay, how do I find now a model and a market? You truly did start with those questions of what would be reimbursable, or what would answer these questions. And then tell us a little bit about your process after that to look at what might answer those questions. How did you even populate the dashboard and go through all of it?
Right. This is a little bit of a McKinseyism or a McKinsey pathology, and so for any of the management consultants in the audience, I'll apologize for this aside. There's a book written by this 1970s McKinsey partner called Start with the Answer.
Right.
And so this is just one of these things that you always hear. And really for me and for us, what that meant was start with the financial model. So build out the financial model, understand what volume needs to look like, what reimbursement needs to look like, understand what it takes in order to be able to justify a field force, what it takes in order to be able to make this interesting from a pharma perspective when you know that there's P&L level competition amongst assets. And so start with the financial model. So we built the financial model. We then worked backward in order to understand what the financial model would mean from an asset perspective. Because obviously it's not good enough to start with the answer. You need some sort of meat and a bottom-up build as well. And this was at the time when it was very chic to try to raise these niche funds. So therapeutic area specific funds, modality specific funds, geography specific funds, and I could sort of give examples of all of those. But I had spent probably 12 to 18 months compiling this list of all things digital. And so we had I don't know, it was maybe somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 hits in terms of things that we thought were both digital and somewhat interesting. And that list then morphed into the feeder list for digital therapeutics. And so if one believes that one wants to build a digital therapeutics company, the first pain point for us was regulatory clearance. And frankly, I mean, we spent up until September of last year trying to get to regulatory clearance. And spoiler alert, that was the first piece of software ever cleared to treat disease. This was a big moment for us. So if you believe that regulatory approval is the bottleneck, then what you need to do is to look for assets. You need to prioritize on data. You need to prioritize on the basis of data quality. And then after you get through all of those things, you need to think about things like therapeutic area, clinician consolidation, and prescriber base. And you
mostly looked at, the academic space, right, to populate a lot of these ideas, and you really limited it to, where there was data out of a study that proved, there was actual efficacy. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And data means different things to different people. And by virtue of sort of bringing together the tech world and the biotech world, we know that this is a very loaded definition. We were looking for what we would affectionately call capital D data. So this is data derived from a randomized clinical trial where patients in the control arm were receiving an active comparator and where efficacy was assessed by an existing means of validating a product, so an existing approvable endpoint in regulatory parlance. And as it turns out, you can very quickly narrow a list like that. So if you're just looking for randomized clinical studies, you can go from 1,500 to probably 500 by snapping your fingers. That's not a hard transition. If you then want to look at the quality of the control arm, you can very quickly decrease the number of studies. And if you then want to look for a clinically and a statistically significant effect, that turns out to be a small group of companies, small group of assets. And that's really what formed the basis for the rolling up of the space that we did across the first year of the company.
And so, again, it's such an easy thing now to look at in retrospect and say, of course that makes sense. But at the conference and kind of at that time, the conventional wisdom would have been to maybe prototype something, get it out, get users, and to try to access payers, and not really go and contact the FDA, right? Because so did people think you were maybe a little crazy for this, or how did people at the time respond when you took this to employees and investors and even the agency and others?
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, this seems like a not unreasonable idea.
Right.
By virtue of the fact that we're here and that people are listening and that we're having this conversation, this kind of makes some sense. When we first pulled together the story, now I would tell you that it's sort of best of both worlds. We get the best of tech, the best of biotech. It was worst of both worlds. So no one understood. Biotech people thought that this was something which didn't have sufficient barriers to entry. And tech people thought that this was something that was way too slow. I remember being out raising the seed round, sitting in front of sort of one of the top 3 most preeminent venture capitalists in digital health. And I'm not going to give the gender of the person because I would give it away, but the person enjoyed the story. And 45 minutes into an hour-long pitch, the person looks at me dead in the eye and says, "So FDA approval, that's slower, right?" And so it just sort of speaks to this total disconnect between concept and practice. I mean, it's fairly obvious that this is slower.
Right.
And so there was a lot.
And more so probably unproven that it could even exist. Right? At the time, there was none. Right.
At the time, there was none. I think we're still, 5 years later, in the midst of generating the first proof point.
Right.
And as I mentioned in painting the background, dogma at that time was that you don't need to get data.
Right.
Dogma was that just push these things out. This will work. And I think, again, if you go back to building the financial model, if you don't believe that there are regulatory advantages, then why in the world would you go and do this? Silicon Valley as a practice also happens to believe that regulatory advantages don't exist. And so, I think this was a hard sell.
And so, tell us maybe a little bit about that, about recruiting your first few investors. How did you break through? As you mentioned, it's sort of, you came at it from a biotech lens. I'm going to go get agency approval and reimbursement and build out a field force. That isn't the way Health IT was looking at this. But ultimately, it still wasn't exactly a traditional drug. It wasn't biotech. It was tech. And so how did you put that round together? And then how did you also put the initial team together? What industries or backgrounds did you look for?
Yeah. So I'll deal with those in sequence. On the investor side, we have the distinct privilege of having a very positive and forward-looking investor base. So we knew that this was a tweener opportunity and that you really needed to go out and get best-of-breed expertise across all of the requisite disciplines here. And so we have a biotech investor, a med tech investor, a tech investor, and now a pharma investor and a growth investor. And the A came together by virtue of bringing together 5AM Ventures on the biotech side, Jazz Ventures on the tech side, and then Arboretum Ventures on the med tech side. And I think if there's a lesson, it's that you got to stick to your guns, you got to stick to your story, but the telling of the story has to be different based upon the person who's on the other side of the table. And so, as we're speaking to a group like 5AM, they've done a lot of work in the specialty pharma space and in the reformulation space, and for the regulatory wonks out there, they've done a lot of 505(b)(2)s. And so as we were originally putting together the story, it was to think about the world in the context of a very rapid path to a novel pharma product with drug-like reimbursement. As we were thinking about the people in the tech side of the room, it was about how you leverage the speed and the iterative properties of software,
right,
how you optimize data, and how you optimize for touch points. And then Arboretum is, as a med tech investor, has gotten burned on many different medical device ramps and reimbursement stories. And so it is, how do you develop the payer proof points in order to get these things paid for? And so, I think it's a great syndicate in that it keeps us honest. This is one of these stories where, it's not like biotech where you wake up in the middle of the night and there's been a safety signal and all of a sudden your company blows up. So there's not that kind of binary risk. But there is multiplicative risk in series where if you were to soberly say probability of technical success times probability of regulatory risk times probability of reimbursement risk times probability of clinician utilization, if you're to multiply all of those things out, you can convince yourself not to do this pretty quickly.
Right.
And so, we really saw a bunch of glasses half full investors who were looking to make big bets, who were all people that I had personally had the opportunity to work with in some context before, and who I held in the absolute highest regard. I don't want to sort of sully the stage, but I have a no jerks rule, and if this was a smaller group, you'd hear different language, but just the people that I will work with on boards are the best of the best, who are incredibly high productivity, low ego, and that is every single person that we have the opportunity to work with.
That's great. How did you think about the proof points before the seed, before the A, before the different rounds? You're kind of, again, in a little bit of uncharted territory, but did you go down more of a biotech, way of thinking about that? Or how did you think about, okay, I'm going to raise this much money when? And how long will that last me until the next round? And what will I prove in between?
Right. Yeah, and I guess if we go back to building the financial model, as I think about the different raises and the different use of proceeds, and all of our models had been built out to like the bazillionth cell. Our diligence decks were like 300 slides, 10 punchy upfronts, and 290 backups. You have to write the investor memo for the investor.
Spoken like a true management consultant.
And so, we built out the company very much like you would expect a biotech company to be built out.
Right.
And so if you think about those inflection points, it is get the data, get the approval, get the market traction, get the reimbursement, get the revenue, get the profit, in that order.
Right.
And we're sort of in the middle of that story. I would just note that that is not the order that you would approach this in if you were going to take a traditional tech approach.
Right.
So it would be get the users, get the feedback, iterate, build the MVP, or whatever that means, and that's a whole loaded term within my office, and everybody wants to call it something different. But we had all investors who were familiar with what a biotech cap table looks like, what a biotech financial model and P&L looks like. And we spoke a little bit before about running single variable experiments with the agency. I think you run single variable experiments with your investors as well. So you ask them to make one cognitive leap. In this particular case, it's that the thing is software. They shouldn't have to think too hard about the financial model, about any of the components of the process. Even the smartest, most well-intentioned of investors are concerned with downside protection, and so they're interested in making one leap investments.
Right.
If this works, then.
We'll talk more about what you mean by the single variable experiment maybe later when we talk about the agency, but at least I'm understanding it as change only one thing, right? So basically you stuck with the life sciences approach and just said the product will be digital, but everything else is the same.
Or change one thing at a time.
At a time.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's
exactly. Right. And so how then do you build out your team, right? Because I'm hearing you say, okay, MVP, we're not iterating in that way, but you're building a team in the Bay Area, and you're hiring engineers and designers, presumably, and others, and they're probably coming from environments where it's pretty baked into how they work to get feedback and iterate and so on and so forth. So how did that process work about the core team, and how has that gone?
It was harder than you would think.
Right. I can imagine.
I think if there's one of many lessons in moving from an investor world to an operator world is that people are complex. It was hard, and I want to be very forthcoming in that we got it wrong more times than we got it right, and every time that we got it wrong, we fixed one thing and moved forward. And so, when we first started, we thought that engagement was going to be the key here, that this was going to be all about engagement. And so we went out and we hired a bunch of people who had been successful gamers, game designers, and game coders. And this is not a crazy approach. If you look at Akili Interactive, who is sort of the other player in the space, this is exactly what they've done. And it's worked for them. It didn't work for us at all. What we found was that in order to do one of these regulatory submissions, you needed to pull together a quality management system. Every single line of code needed to be coded in a GMP-compliant way, and gamers hated that. Right. I mean, it was just like no game designer wanted to wake up and do a check-in 3 times a day that led to some sort of V&V testing. It didn't work. And we struggled with all of these different points of terminology. I mentioned MVP, which is something that to this date makes my commercial and clinical people bristle and is the currency of my tech team. A running joke in the company is the acronym API, which means very different things to drug people and tech people. And so we spent a bunch of time talking past one another, talking about the API, which in both fields is incredibly important, but as it turns out, these things have nothing to do with one another. so
That's really funny. Really?
Again,
they would use the term and wow.
It's somewhere between an application program interface and an active pharmaceutical ingredient. And things don't have a damn thing to do with one another.
Right.
But that's not obvious.
Right.
and so
unless you could log into the API and start changing the ingredient and screwing with it, which would not be good.
We can piece together stories in hindsight in which they're related, but
right.
in the moment it wasn't very useful for building a business.
Right.
And so again, we got it really wrong, and the only way that I know how to manage a process like this, and there are times when my team hates me for it, but is to break these things down into their component pieces and throw a bunch of metrics on the story and track the metrics and iterate.
Right.
And again, that's not something that game designers really appreciate all that much. Spoiler alert, like they don't like to build a narrative in the context of productivity. So that did not work very well. What we found is that people who had done some degree of highly structured, highly rigorous software development were the kind of people that we wanted. So people who had dealt with, for example, fintech and regulations around fintech, they were a much more interesting hire for us. People who had built EMRs. Right. As it turns out, building a digital therapeutic, you probably want like 2 parts EMR designer and, I don't know, maybe 1 part someone who's willing to learn. I didn't mention any parts that were game designers. So this is a lesson that we learned the really hard way, and in full candor, we learned it multiple times.
Right.
And so I think what this has been is an evolution to bring all of these different people across different disciplines together, and we are finally, as of this past quarter, at the place where we have an integrated product development process, which involves our product and development team. It involves regulatory, it involves clinical, and it even involves commercial. And so, this is what pharma companies are aiming and struggling to do, which is to really bake commercial insights into the product from day one. I mean, that's what it takes to be successful here. And,
right.
and so, we had to both force fit the people, but then also force them to deal with one another.
Right.
And that was probably one of the more difficult things across building the story.
I mean, I can only imagine. You look at what that's like inside actual life sciences companies, right, between marketing and the business and commercial teams and the actual research units, and they've had a lot of time to get it right. Doing this in this space where it's never been done is really interesting. Now, what about that core team? So did you have co-founders, and tell us about the first 5 hires. How many of those would you say you got right? What were they? What did they do? Where were they? How did you decide to go to SF and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so, and this is all going to be very consistent with a non-traditional build. We basically built a consulting shop first. So if you look at maybe the first 2 or 3 people that we brought on, we were really good at building PowerPoints. We were really good at building Excel models. You look at the PowerPoints from our seed and pre-seed discussions. As it turns out, they're exactly the same damn slides today.
Right.
It's just that they're not flowcharts; they're actually real data. So I think we pulled together a really compelling strategy and story. I think in hindsight, we could have done much better at hiring to our weaknesses as opposed to our strengths.
Right.
But we didn't just go out and build an MVP and get a bunch of user feedback and get a bunch of traction. Right. This was a very different build in that way, and so it felt a lot like a management consulting shop to start.
Right.
I think as we grew, it then became very clear for us that if you wanted to do this at scale, and scale is one of the buzzwords that you'll hear me use just again and again and again. That's our mission, is to do this at scale. You were going to need to access the best talent pools possible across the disciplines that were involved in the story. And for us, and I will acknowledge that educated minds could differ on this, but the best biotech people on the face of the planet sit in Boston, and the best tech people on the face of the planet sit in San Francisco. There are notable exceptions. I'm sure that there are some in this room. But those are the talent pools. And if you want to build to scale, those are the talent pools that we decided to pull from. And so it was a very deliberate decision to say we want a footprint in San Francisco. It has made communication harder. It has made travel more. And it now means that I spend most of my time in somewhere either in one of the 2 cities or between the 2, like today, pinging back and forth. But it was a very deliberate decision to say that this is a scale play. And I think all of these things are by design. They're not by happenstance. We had very good investors who said, this is a story about scale. We don't care about you being successful once. We care about you being successful with an approach across a portfolio. And so, in all cases, they've been very, very supportive of the long vision. And, just sort of the idiot's guide to investor mentality, I think if you take their current fund size and divide that by 10-ish, that's roughly the amount of cash that they need to put to work in your investment. And if they've put more than half of that into the first round, then you should probably think about them being a short-term investor. If they put less than half of that in the first round, then they're a long-term investor. And optimize the story however you like, but if you want to build a long-term story, bring on a long-term investor base.
Right. And so maybe tell us about, how when you were first starting up, as you drill down from maybe 1,500 to the 500 and then beyond that, how you made that decision about how many assets or products to develop, right? How did you choose to parallel path things versus say, I want to focus on just a few? And how did you do that in the context of the fact that you weren't out necessarily going and getting users or customers right away? You were then next going to the agency. So how, in the absence of that kind of feedback cycle,
Right.
How did you make those decisions?
Yeah, so, I think, again, we have great investors who took the long view, and the approach that we've taken, you need those kind of investors in order to take this kind of an approach. But again, we assumed that getting to approval was going to be the most difficult part of the company's first chapter, and that to get to approval, you needed to optimize for probability of clinical success. And if we were sitting at any of the drug companies here in town, you think about their portfolio theory, and there's always some consultant who's put together a 2x2 matrix, which is size of unmet medical need times probability of technical success. That's the way that you optimize a portfolio. And so, we did just the same. I mentioned before that my passion is in brain-related conditions, but we didn't set out to build a CNS company. In fact, we would still push very hard on the notion that we are a CNS company. We're a prescription digital therapeutics company with a mandate to get 5 of these approved in the next 5 years and then grow thereafter. But just by happenstance, when you look at places where cognitive experience is known to be a treatment and where the size of unmet need is incredibly high, those happen to be in CNS. And when you parse that more finely, addiction comes to the very top of the heap. It's well known that face-to-face cognitive behavioral therapy is an effective modality for treating patients with addiction. And if you sort of start to look at the world through this efficacy lens, which for us is just a key part of the story, psychiatrists are one of the few, if not the only clinicians who are able to create efficacy via an in-office visit.
Yeah.
They talk to people, they make those people better, and the ways in which they make those people better are approvable from an FDA perspective if one is thinking about a drug. So if you take, for example, depression, CBT for depression enhances the very same set of downstream metrics as an SSRI like Prozac for depression. They're one and the same. You're sort of all tapping into the same set of modalities. And so that's how we wound up with addiction as our lead set of assets that then later turned into 2 sub-products, a product that treats addiction outside of opiate use disorder. That's our Reset product. We'll talk more about that. And then a product that treats opiate use disorder specifically. That's our Reset-O product. We'll talk more about both these things. But that was the requisite clinical parsing of quote-unquote addiction. And again, I think while I mentioned that we have a very, very positive and long-standing investor base, I think had we come out of the gate and failed our first clinical study,
Right.
I mean, that kills biotech investor bases, which are just as, as long-lived. So I think we knew that we needed to get that right out of the gate.
So maybe we will talk about both products a little bit now, and also the fact that you got the approval, which is really kind of a momentous step for what could and hopefully will turn into an industry with peers that follow as well. And so, what was that like? So you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to parallel path a couple of these things, and these become maybe the front runners. How did you first make that call into the FDA and say, boy, I want to, get approval and a label as a treatment for software as a drug? And what was the response, and how did you manage that ultimately? And then tell us a little bit about these two products and how they work. And while he does that, I just want to let everybody in the audience know if you have a question, we're going to move into Q&A next. So please go on to social Q&A and upvote your favorite questions.
Great. So maybe just to frame the agency, and I know that they get a really bad rap, and I know that people are in a lot of ways afraid of the agency. Their mandate is to make patients better, very simply. And I think if you look at that mandate in the context of brain-related conditions, and specifically in the context of addiction-related conditions, there is almost nothing in the pipeline, and there are 30 million Americans that suffer from these conditions, and we are in the midst of an epidemic. So it is a good thing for them to be able to make a positive contribution to treating this set of patients. So I think maybe the first bullet point is make the conversation sufficiently specific so that you can anchor it in these sorts of concepts. I think had we gone to the agency and said, we want to get software approved like a drug, they would have said, well, what does that mean? And there's nothing worse than a nebulous regulatory conversation, because you will always get something that makes an investor or a partner worry. So I think you have to come in with a specific ask. So I think that was the way that we sharpened the ask. On the approach, we then...
So basically, when you approached the agency, it wasn't around this concept of, software as a drug. It was, we see this unmet need, and we think we know how to do something about it.
So we see this unmet need. We think we have an answer. Here's the clinical data. This clinical data is highly significant in a way that you acknowledge to be highly significant. How do we work together in order to bring this to patients? So there was a good degree of specificity around the ask. That said, I'm going to directly contradict myself, which is that in our first conversation with the agency, the first slide that we showed them was a slide of our pipeline. And that was to let them know that we are a well-funded going concern, and that this is about an approach. So this is not a one-off conversation where if things don't go well, we'll go away. This is about a conversation where we believe that this is fundamentally the right approach. We believe that this is what patients deserve and clinicians demand, and we're here to work with you until we get this right.
Sure.
And so, in hindsight, it seems like a reasonable strategy because it worked. There are many reasons why it could have not worked, but that was the general approach.
Were there some moments along the way where you thought, boy, we're headed down the wrong track? They're not receptive, or they're not understanding it, or this might not happen? Or did you sort of feel like there was a sense that this should and will happen along the whole ride? Maybe both.
Yeah, and not just a little, but lots of both every day. And this is maybe my Chicago connection. So I was thinking about real inflection points along the process, and we were joking before this that there are a lot of negative surprises in life. So like bad news tends to come up and just slap you in the face. But success is usually death by 1,000 cuts. So like you kind of know it's coming, and then you know it's coming later, and then it doesn't come later, but it comes right after that. And so by the time it finally comes, you're kind of sick of it. And that's just sort of the way that the world works. But there was this one very pronounced inflection point in the process which took place in Chicago. And so I wind up here maybe 2 to 3 times a year. For the life of me, I can't remember why I was here, but I assume it must have been useful or important. I have no idea. But I was in the W City Center, and I'm a Starwood preferred guest loyalist. Has nothing to do with what I'm about to tell you, but I always stay in the W. So I'm in the W.
You should send them that clip for like quadruple platinum status.
Sure, I'll take points. Absolutely. So I'm in the W. And anytime I travel to give a talk, which is why I must have been here, it always turns into like a very brief appearance at the conference and then nothing but conference calls in the hotel room.
Right.
And so this was one of these like conference calls in between some time in the hotel gym and showering, and I just sort of remember like being in my gym attire, and we are on the phone with the agency, and it was sort of, and I wish that I could divulge the exact details here, but this sort of gets into how the sausage is made and probably isn't appropriate for a forum like this. But it was that moment where there was one question that was still outstanding, which represented binary risk, i.e. this could either work or it couldn't work. And my job is across every day of my life to take binary risk off the table. And it was just sort of that aha moment where the agency said, yes, that approach will work. We appreciate the rigor of your response. Go for it. And we have, as most of them are, a very domineering head of regulatory who basically lets you talk when she lets you talk. And so it was just sort of one of these moments where the agency got off the line, and then we all kind of celebrated together as a team.
Oh my goodness.
And from that moment on, it was success / death by 1,000 cuts. So it was like, we know it's coming. When is it coming? But that was the moment.
Well, ultimately, you got, what, 15 minutes notice that the agency was putting out a press release that it was going up?
That's the story, and I have a very rich history of being wrong, and I was just, and this is another Chicago story. Congrats on the Avexis exit, by the way. It's just so unbelievably impressive. And for the non-pharma people, it's probably the biggest deal in pharma this year, and it's a local story. And I was catching up with some of the people from Avexis last night, and they had come to me 6 months ago telling me how excited they were and how big of a story this was going to be. I basically told them, like, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Like, and I just want to say I was completely wrong on that story. Just in a binary way, couldn't have been more wrong. And similarly, when it came to the FDA's press release around our clearance, I was similarly wrong. So we had this office bet, which was the amount of time that will elapse between clearance and an FDA press release. And I sort of went on record shooting my mouth off in print with my team, so in print internally, that there was, and I quote, a de minimis chance that the FDA would beat us to this press release. So do other things that are more important and stop worrying about this. And as it turns out, we had, I think it was somewhere, it was like 17 minutes, if you look back exactly, between getting the FDA clearance letter and the FDA's press release going out about the clearance letter. And so, there's this adage, always control the narrative. All of a sudden, it was this great moment. We had just done what we had spent so much time trying to do, and 17 minutes later, it was like, oh my God, we've lost control of the narrative.
Right.
We need to get on top of this. And so then it was time for me to eat crow and try to motivate the team in order to get back on top of this. And it all wound up fine. But I will not forget that. And nor will my team. They use the word de minimis a good deal in our conversations.
Two things we didn't talk as much about is how pharma and how payers are responding to this. And our top two rated questions are exactly along those lines. So, how do you see pharma and biotech adopting these digital therapies in the next few years? How do you, what's the relationship like between that industry and this industry that you're at the forefront of? And then similarly with payers, that's the next big chapter here, I think, of this. And so how have they responded? Are they responding to this? And how is that going? What do you think will happen?
Yeah, I mean, it has been an education process, and we have seen just a huge evolution across the last 5 years. 5, 6 years ago, this was such a stupid idea that people didn't even understand it. And I think we've progressed to the point where pharma now thinks it's their own idea, which is where you want them to be.
Right.
I think that part of the evolution has been just a very, very positive thing. We've had a lot of stop-start conversations. While all of the things that we just talked through here, it's like process on process, and our Gantt charts have Gantt charts, and all of these things are incredibly complex. storytelling needs to be simple. And so I think when we are out communicating this, both to pharma and to payers, so I'll take both versions of the story. To pharma, we are an asset. So by virtue of being an approved and having a product code, we're an asset. We have best of breed efficacy data on an existing approvable endpoint in a large market indication. And those are all things that pharma understands. That, those are terms of art in pharma. It just so happens that if you build out the list of comparables, and pharma loves comps, if you build out the list of comps, it's really hard to find an asset that satisfies all of those criteria and hasn't been a success. So it's sort of our very simple way of articulating that this is a big thing and get on board. And I think, luckily, or maybe just due to sheer persistence, I think we're at that tipping point. On the payer side, it's a similarly simple story, but it's an equally simple but different story, which is your people are sick, what you're doing isn't working, we make them better. Ta-da! That's a really, really simple way to tell the story. And I think if you're then to be able to hang all of the points of rigor that we have onto that very simple story, it's something that resonates. I say all of this in the context of being in the middle of this part of the story. So we are very deeply rooted in the pre-commercial launch phase. That's actually why the Novartis announcement from last week is so important. This is the group that provides the sales force to go out and detail clinicians and all of the payer support that goes out to get this thing onto a traditional reimbursement schedule. So I think we've got all of the pieces in place. That's not to say that this is a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination, but I think if you, again, start to think about an efficacy sale, where in our pivotal studies, across all comers, twice as many patients who saw the reset product hit the primary endpoint of abstinence, and in refractory patient populations, between 5 and 10-fold more patients hit the primary endpoint. So there's some spreads of the data where 3% of patients who got the best breed face-to-face care hit the primary, and 30% of patients who got the digital therapeutic hit the primary. That's a huge, huge spread.
Right.
And I think we want to put pharma in a position where they made a bad read by passing on that kind of efficacy data. And we want to put payers in a position where it's really hard to not pay for that kind of data. And I think, as I mentioned earlier in the day, this is all about demonstrating quality. And we have put together a very detailed and articulate health economic outcome story. And we're pricing the product as a derivative of cost per quality. So the amount of qualities generated and a dollar per quality ratio, which makes this something which is very, very favorable across the drug landscape.
Maybe we'll try a few more here in a lightning round.
Hit me.
So, in pioneering a new space as an entrepreneur, do you sell more by sharing a story, a vision, or through data? And were you prepared for both? Can you talk maybe about that?
I think a lot of this is going to be derivative of the definition of data. I think just being a pragmatist, I think you sell the story first because you don't have data.
Right.
And then you hang data on the story as soon as you have it. If we think about the implication of looking at thousands of deals a year if you're an investor,
right,
what that suggests is that any CEO's role is to raise money. And the best way to raise money is to have as many investor conversations as often as you possibly can and demonstrate traction and demonstrate progress. So it probably feels like a little bit of a cop-out, but I think the best answer is both.
Both. Can you speak a little bit about the MS therapy that PEAR is developing?
I'm going to be deliberately vague and say that this is maybe let's take a step back. So if again our one sentence mission here is digital is the asset, what that implies is that you can do asset-centric deals with these digital therapeutics. And so in pharma, an asset-centric deal has 3 flavors. It's a discovery deal, i.e. something that doesn't yet exist, leverages a platform but doesn't yet exist. It's a development stage deal, something which has some clinical data and needs more clinical data in order to get to approval. or it's a commercial stage deal, which is something that has approvable data and or approval and now needs to be sold. And so it's been our mandate to validate the model by doing all of those types of deals. There were 2 announcements that came out in, I want to say, the past 8 weeks. One is obviously this partnership with Novartis through their Sandoz organization. That's the commercial deal. That's to commercialize Reset and Reset-O, the late-stage products. And then we did another deal with them around a product in MS, as well as our product in schizophrenia, and that's the first 2 flavors of deals. So this MS deal is about leveraging our platform to come together with their disease area focus and expertise in order to develop novel digital therapeutics to treat a disease area that they're very familiar with and very interested in. So I've said nothing about this, but that's because I can't say anything about this. The schizophrenia deal is, again, that's the development stage deal. That's to take the rest of that asset across the finish line and then commercialize thereafter.
2 more quick questions here. So the first is, how is a digital therapeutic patent protected?
So it is a great question, and not surprisingly, it is one of the first things that we thought through as a company. I think if you're going to take the time to invest in clinical development and all of these regulatory affairs activities, you need to have some sort of barriers to entry or a moat, or every investor will ask you this. They'll ask the same question, just phrased differently. For us, we started the company doing a very rigorous freedom to operate screen. Again, we're biotech people. First thing you do is you do an FTO screen. You don't assume that patents are worthless. That's the tech approach to things. And we tripped over this huge family of IP that read all around software systems and methods of treatment for digital therapeutics and drug software combinations. So we believed, and our investors believed, that that IP was blocking and was core to being able to play in the space. And so we did a deal to take an exclusive license to that whole family of IP. And skip to the answer here, there is no composition of matter. Right. So in the pharma space, composition of matter is the holy grail, and that's basically the case that you get that hangs on a bunch of benzene rings or some sequence, which says that other people can't do this. But through really a meshwork of method of treatment and software systems claims, we believe that the space that we're playing in is eminently protectable. I think we're up to something like 600 granted claims and have a very, very aggressive IP portfolio going forward. I think this is a hard financial model to float if you don't believe that there's any sort of exclusivity here. I would also just point out that our regulatory approval has this thing called special controls that's associated with the approval document. And basically what that means is that anyone that wants to come down this path needs to run both a safety and an efficacy study in order to demonstrate any degree of equivalence. I think if you look at that mandate in the context of dealing with severe medical conditions, which are not addressable via traditional health and wellness approaches via the App Store. So, we talked about this a little bit earlier today. This is why you haven't seen us do smoking cessation, because there's not enough patient risk associated with smoking cessation to be able to justify the regulatory lift. We have, on the other hand, on the addiction continuum, done opiate dependence, because a misfiring treatment in opiate dependence could lead to overdose and or death, which makes this an imminently regulatable thing, which makes this what it takes to get this approved and prescribed.
So I want to make sure you make your flight. So
I appreciate that.
I have to end this soon, but I'll obligate you to something because this is so interesting. When you come back here, 3, 4, or 5 years from now, maybe sooner at the pace things are going, what do you hope to tell us? Give us a sense of, if this is 2021 or 2022, where is PEAR? Where is this industry? What do you hope to accomplish between now and then?
Yeah, so I think since we're wrapping up here, I'm just going to ask you that in return, if this doesn't work, we won't talk about it, and if this does work, then we'll all celebrate.
Deal.
We've really tried to build up, with all hyperbole intended, the Genentech of digital therapeutics. And what that means is that we see a huge opportunity space here. We've tried to build up the company that's capable of developing the 50 or 60 of these things, which is, roughly speaking, what we think the therapeutic area landscape looks like. It is well beyond CNS, well beyond CBT. And you skip 5 years into the future, we're currently capitalized and running at an approval a year for the next 5 years. And so that's the bullseye. Thereafter, it is to think about the expansion opportunity to really create the engine that builds the space. And if, again, you think about the biotech pharma playbook, what we will be looking for is areas of high unmet need and areas of high provider consolidation. Because, again, this is all about a financial model, and it's crazy for me to go to my board and tell them that we're going to sell into primary care. If I need more than 50 or 60 sales reps, we probably shouldn't do it.
Can't do it.
And so you will see us continue to commercialize opportunities that require a large field force, and you will see some sort of a derivative royalty and milestone stream off of those assets. And then you'll see us run at self-commercialization of some of these highly consolidated specialty markets. And we have a product that we believe has approvable data for 2020 clearance after Reset and Reset-O to check that box.
Well, thank you again for joining us. It's really very exciting, very interesting. Thank you very much for stopping by.